This is University Lecture. Welcome to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, the concluding portion of an address by consumer advocate Ralph Nader. Mr. Nader spoke in James Hilton Coliseum in November of last year. His topic is concerned with the public and its relationship with corporate interest and government bureaucracy. We begin with some remarks given by Mr. Nader at the conclusion of the part of his address broadcast last week. Mr. Nader.
Now, what do you do when a bureaucracy refuses systematically to enforce the law that it is sworn to uphold? Well, that's a problem that challenges the very guts of our democratic process. Because if we cannot make people responsible for their official decisions in government, we're never going to make government agencies responsible, or government, period. You can't make institutions responsible unless you make people in those institutions accountable for the consequences direct of their use of power. The whole problem of bureaucracies receives so little attention in the educational system. That doesn't mean that there have to be courses called Bureaucracy 101 or Bureaucracy 302. It does mean that there has to be a deep empirical inquiry into precisely how a bureaucracy can be so inefficient, so costly, so inhumane, so unaccountable, or how it can be, on occasions, a marvel of administrative efficiency or responsive. Take the models as well as the caricatures. This requires a kind of empirical investigation that's got to go way beyond the traditional political science or civics textbooks, which sort of have this formalistic description of how things are supposed to work, with a few dashes on what lobbies are supposed to do or what special interest groups are supposed to do. But very, very little empirical content on exactly how does Program A in Washington or in Des Moines actually work. How does the Insurance Commission in Des Moines work? Exactly. How are complaints handled? How are rate requests handled? What's the political and economic process and interchange? What are the conflicts of interest? What's the problem of an adversary system that doesn't have an adversary except for special interest representation, but not for the public interest? Who decides these questions? Is there such a thing as aggrieved citizens filing suit and making a government official accountable, or making him disclose information that's secret and has been withheld? These are very, very important issues, because they deal with the overriding problem of whether we can organize ourselves to deal with problems in this country. And that's the problem of the delivery system of bureaucratic structures. A bureaucracy has a dimension to it in terms of corporate participation and control. What are we going to do about the corporate sector in the country as it challenges some of our basic value systems, as it runs increasingly out of control, as it increasingly dominates the economy in fewer and fewer corporate hands? You've seen it in the agricultural areas as these giant integrated agribusiness firms move in more and more. What does that mean? We're now seeing that it doesn't necessarily mean efficiency. Indeed, that the minimal scale of economies on a farm have far been exceeded by giant outfits like Tenneco or the Tejon Ranch in California, or any number of giant agribusiness corporations. About 3 years ago, I went down to the Department of Agriculture and I said, would you please supply me with a study that details the concentration of land ownership in the United States? They said, we don't have that data. I said, you don't have that data? You don't have information that can tell a citizen how many firms own what percentage of what land in what state in the United States? They said, no, we don't compile it. Well, I had to remind them that about 10 years before that, I obtained from the Department of Agriculture the most detailed studies of the concentration of land ownership in the Central American countries, in Latin America, in Asia, In other words, they had concentration studies on many of the underdeveloped countries right down to the percentage point, but they didn't have any right here in the USA. And there turns out to be a pretty good reason for that. It's an explosive political issue. If people realize the enormous concentration of land ownership in Southern California in a few giant corporate ranch-type operations, ranging from 3 to 500,000 acre spreads, or if they realize, for example, that in Texas there are single land holdings that are larger than the state of Delaware, they begin pondering the economic and political and democratic consequences of that for small businesses, small farmers, consumers, citizens, everywhere. And if you don't have the data, obviously you're not going to be able to generate that kind of issue for public discussion. Another way of putting it is any institution, whether it's a corporation or a government agency, that can control the flow of information can pretty much control the flow of policy decision making. And the flow of information is the first step in breaking the log jams to develop the government, as the saying goes, of the people, by the people, and for the people. The function of freedom of flow of information is one of the chief areas of restrictive concentration by any deteriorating bureaucracy, one that doesn't want external forces to evaluate its performance. And the best way to assure that result is to clamp down hard on the doors of secrecy. The corporations, however, have managed to penetrate governmental apparatus quite openly. There's no conspiracy necessary. They have done it by having their trade associations, their campaign fund contributions, their corporate lawyers right there at the scene of the action in Washington and state capitals. If anything, these new buildings that are going up in Washington, you say, how can this city keep building these office buildings? Well, as long as these trade groups and these company offices keep coming in, they're going to keep building these office buildings. That's Washington's principal industry outside of government. And there they are. They know what's going on in the Department of Interior before the Secretary of Interior knows what's going on. The oil industry can find out what's being proposed because they're largely doing the proposing right inside the Department of Interior, which is nothing more than an accounts receivable for the oil industry to begin with. Many of the top officials shuttle in and out of the industry, and they go into government for a little on-the-job training in order to make them more useful when they go back into the corporate framework. The conflict of interest potential here, of course, is potentially very devastating. In fact, it's matured in its devastation in the following programs. The oil industry, a long time ago, threw capitalism over the board. They can't stand competitive economic systems. They want control. They developed a world cartel, and they've developed production quota limits in the United States to keep supply at a level so that the prices don't go down too far. And they've developed their own tax privileges and the tax laws, the oil depletion allowance, the write-off of intangibles. And finally, they decided, well, let's have the final destruction of the competitive mechanism. They went to Washington in 1959, and by executive order, they didn't even go through Congress. That would be far too cumbersome. They got the president to sign an executive order saying, in effect, that there would be a limitation on the importation of oil into this country, 12% of domestic consumption, which in effect sealed off a main force to drive down the price of gasoline and fuel products, energy, if you will, to the consumer. And so people go to their gas stations every day and they pay a nickel extra a gallon because the oil industry, many of whom control these foreign oil sources, not like you're giving business to foreigners, because the oil industry, in effect, has controlled supply in such a way as to keep the domestic price of oil up, a nickel a gallon, at least. That adds up to a lot of money, particularly when you add fuel prices, home fuel prices. It adds up, according to Nixon's own task force on the oil import quota, to $5 to $7 billion a year. That's what the consumer is directly subsidizing the oil industry, which cannot stand free and open competition. And what we're seeing is a basic transformation of our political economic system into what has been called the corporate state, which really means the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few large corporations. And 200 of the biggest corporations in this country own about 70% of the productive capacity of the nation. The concentration then moves into the public arena and begins controlling government or public resources, so that you get these multi-billion-dollar subsidies, tax breaks, free research and development, so that you get protection from competition through import quotas, so that you get licenses and monopolies and routes sealed off from competition. And when this occurs, you break down the arm's-length relationship between government and business, which is the most serious single breakdown in the vitality of a democratic polity to respond to the problems of the age. Because if people are being victimized, they look to representative government to remedy this victimization by the application of the law. But if that government is in the hands of the special interest groups to begin with, what is the alternative for people when they can't resort to representative government? The alternative is basically to question whether the wholesale delegation of citizenship rights can be given to appointed and elected officials, and then people turn around and start watching their television sets and forget about their citizenship responsibilities. Any legal system has got to be premised on the principle that wherever there are victims of processes, the power has to accrete to the victims. Now that, of course, is the history of the populist and progressive period, as it partially developed a reshift of power back to the farmers to deal with some of the problems. In short, every progressive move in the country starts with a recognition of victimization and a drive to reallocate political and economic power so that those victims can relieve themselves of these unjust processes. The corporation at the present time is a structure that is highly immunized from legal reach by its victims. Not just the point of how inaccessible the law is to the average consumer, but how inaccessible the government is for consumers and citizens to do much about. We tend to forget, I think, that the corporation is a creature of the state. The state creates the corporation. And what the state can give, the state can condition. And what it can give, it can take away. And there isn't a corporation in this country that doesn't have a charter creating it by a state, whether it's New York or Iowa or what's more likely Delaware. And that charter, which in effect says to a group of petitioners who want to start a corporation, we will let you constitute yourself as a corporation. We will give you privileges. For example, perpetuity, limited liability, and a whole host of others. But in return, you've got to obey certain rules, and these rules are in the charter. Well, now, the rules haven't been rewritten for over 100 years, and that charter remains the same virtually as it was 100 years ago. And not only that, but there has been developed a corporate Reno called the state of Delaware. The state of Delaware, a number of decades ago, decided that it was going to develop an industry. That is, it was going to sell its corporate law. It was going to make it so easy, so flexible, so manipulable to charter your corporation in Delaware that it would attract all these giant corporations from Illinois and New York and elsewhere into the state to be chartered. And if you look at the roster of corporations chartered in Delaware, you'll see companies like Ford, GM, International Telephone and Telegraph Company, First National City Bank Holding Company, Chase Manhattan, and some of the biggest corporations in the world have suddenly found over a period of years that Delaware is the most facilitative legal jurisdiction for them to be chartered in. Now, the federal government does not charter these corporations. That's how behind the times the law is. Here you've got corporations that operate throughout the world in 100 countries. You've got a company like the International Telephone and Telegraph Company that's on its way to buying up the USA. And where is it chartered? In this tiny, itty-bitty little state of Delaware, the home of the DuPonts. And Delaware couldn't control these corporations even if it had the will to do so, which it doesn't. And it certainly doesn't have the resources. General Motors could buy lock, stock, and barrel the state of Delaware, if DuPont was willing to sell it, that is. And what we need, I think, is to recognize that if we're going to make corporations more responsive to remedying the injustices that are being heaped on people, from the range of consumer abuses to pollution, to overpricing, to price fixing, and the whole host of laws that are being continually violated, such as illegal underpayment of property taxes, that's a rampant epidemic all over the country on the part of copper, steel, chemical, oil, coal, auto, and other companies. Now, if these are going to be looked at, they've got to be looked at first in terms of a complete reconsideration of the terms of the corporate charter and the establishment of a federal chartering agency that in effect says if corporations are going to be engaged in these kinds of activities, that compact with the public that the charter represents is going to have to be brought up to the 1970s from the 1870s when the rules were basically etched. Now, these corporations raise another challenge, as in fact does government itself, and that is citizenship. The very word evokes boredom. The very word. For many people in this country, citizenship is what you get if you come in from a foreign land and stick around long enough, or it's what somebody does if he votes every 2 or 4 years. The whole concept of citizenship is so bland and so empty and so bereft of the requisite strategies of action that to even talk about it either evokes ennui or a kind of smile and cynicism. And yet that is what it's all about. Because basically once you get through developing a theory of accountability, which is important for understanding a society, once you, for example, see that the mess in the courts is a primary responsibility of the legal profession, not doctors, and the problems in the hospitals are a primary responsibility of the medical profession. And when it comes to auto pollution, the primary responsibility is not the driver who puts his car into motion. He doesn't have a choice. It's the auto companies who design that infernal internal combustion engine and who refuse to allocate the most minimal resources to displace it because it would cut down on some of their capital investments and on their aftermarket parts. In other words, the theory of accountability develops primary, secondary, tertiary levels of responsibility for various problems. Those forces that produce the problem in the first place, those forces who can prevent the solution from occurring and do try to, those forces in effect who perpetuate these conditions, these are primarily responsible forces. But once you get through developing a theory of accountability, what about the theory of citizenship obligation? Because if it's true that only people are going to be able to improve the society around them, then it rests upon us to develop some sort of concept and obligation of citizenship. Because if citizenship is a privilege, as we're constantly told, it's not going to be a privilege very long if it's not considered an obligation. And if people don't develop a role of citizenship as it applies to themselves or to others, they're not going to, I think, recognize that the bootstrap type of democratic power resurgence that's necessary is one that requires grassroots action. It's happened before, you know. I mean, the old progressives and populists didn't build a paradise, but they grappled with a lot of serious problems and leveled some of them to levels of tolerance. They also learned how to organize. They also learned how to do the impossible, organize people who were living far apart from one another, like farmers or people in rural areas. And this raises the question as to what kind of roles of citizenship are we talking about? And basically we're talking about three roles. One, which is the best known, part-time citizens, spend a few hours a week organizing and applying community action to various problems. A second one is one that's beginning to emerge in what is called the public interest law movement. That is, where you have full-time professional citizens, lawyers, scientists, economists, accountants, organizers, any skill that is merited in terms of its contribution, where people spend full time being citizens, not being part of any bureaucracy or institution, but standing on their 2 feet in their value systems, and because of their skill and their full-time support, developing the role of the full-time citizen, going around improving, shaping, exposing, reshaping, displacing worse institutions with better institutions. This is the ultimate role of a citizen in a democracy, but obviously not everybody can be a full-time citizen. But clearly we need tens of thousands of full-time citizens. If we've got 15,000 cosmetologists and X thousand bird watchers, I think we can afford a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of full-time citizens, supported by citizens, by consumer dues, by the kind of student contributions that the iceberg idea embodies. The third type of citizenship is perhaps by far the most propulsive and the most dynamic, and that's on-the-job citizenship. And that is simply the following. There is hardly an abuse or an injustice or a solution to injustices and abuse in this country that is not known by several hundred or thousand of people who work in organizations, whether they're government or corporate or union or what have you. That is, whether it's vehicle defects known by people on the assembly line and the auto plants, or whether it's the chemists in the drug industry that know when and where these drugs have adverse effects that aren't being disclosed, or whether they're employees in the government that know of tremendous waste or corruption. All of these abuses are not entirely secret. They're known by hundreds, if not thousands, of employees. The question, the agonizing question, that confronts the more conscientious of them is the following. What happens when there's a conflict of allegiance? When the corporate or the governmental agency orders obedience on the part of the employee to criminal or corrupt or wasteful or harmful or abusive or polluting activities of that organization, and orders this kind of blind allegiance and this complicity. To give you an illustration, about 5 years ago, a quality control inspector in the Chevrolet plant, in the Fisher Body plant, in St. Louis. It's a division of Chevrolet. He was inspecting four-door Chevys going off the line, and he saw that there were inadequate number of welds. The conclusion was obvious. There's going to be an increased risk of combustion gases seeping into the passenger compartment when these cars are on a highway full of passengers. And that includes carbon monoxide seeping. So he wrote on his little inspection sheet what he discovered, and he sent it to the plant manager, and he was told to go back and mind his own business. So whereupon he said that's what he thought he was doing. So he wrote another inspection report up. He kept doing this for about a year until he was ordered to stop. He wasn't shown to be wrong. He was just ordered to stop because he was slowing down that production line, one of the cardinal sins in the auto industry. And so he had to decide, was he going to keep quiet and let what turned out to be millions of people drive in cars that were leaking into the passenger compartment these harmful gases? Well, he decided no. In effect, he took his materials, after exhausting his remedies inside the company, took his materials, sent them to Washington, and it took a few months, but 2.5 million Chevys were recalled for correction of these defects. And what did GM do? They fire him? No. Why? Because he wasn't an engineer. If he was an engineer without a union, he could have been shown the door at 5 p.m. But he belonged to a union which had a grievance procedure. In other words, it said that all members of this union cannot be fired by management unless they're given due process. And how do you fire a quality control inspector for doing his job? That is, finding defects. So instead of firing him, they gave him a $10,000 savings bond, whereupon he promptly cashed it apparently knowing what inflation was going to do to it. And he bought a boat because he was a fisherman on the Mississippi. He started fishing. He found out he was fishing all kinds of pollutants and debris. And so he bought a camera. He went up and down the river in a boat, and he photographed effluent pipes coming from various industries and developed the pictures and started disseminating them. Now, that is really citizenship on the job. That's a classic example of the kind of activity, of a kind of heroism, of the kind of really basic, genuine patriotism that our political leaders should pay recognition to. But do you think that Mr. Gregory would be invited to the White House to meet the president, or to the governor of the state to meet the governor? Of course not. He's neither a comedian, an actor, a corporate polluter, a campaign fund giver, so he doesn't qualify. And all over the country, there are individual citizens who are in effect applying their convictions to problems in the community and not discouraging and not being despairing, and in effect overcoming overwhelming odds. Now, they're not changing the whole country. They're not transforming it into a paradise. But when you consider their tiny input and the kinds of progress that they have achieved, you might ask the question, suppose that tiny input was increased 1,000,000-fold. Suppose, by some quirk of fate, Americans would spend 1/3 less of their time watching pro football, bowling, sitting under the hairdryer, chatting on the telephone, or watching the soap operas. Suppose such a revolution came about, and they spent that 1/3 of their time on citizenship involvement, which would meet all the needs that these other so-called leisure activities try to meet: overcoming alienation, overcoming boredom, overcoming the lack of feeling of participation and giving and contributing and usefulness. Then we would see that that kind of leverage, combined with the professional full-time citizens, would have a very remarkable effect. The crude fact of the matter is in this country, as in all countries in the world, we have never developed a professionalization of citizenship effort. Almost everything is supposed to be skilled in all the occupations that we learn and read about and involve ourselves in, except the most important one of all, which is citizenship. And the idea of developing systematic strategies, new kinds of roles, the idea of being able to show citizens in the community how they can reform that property tax, how they can clean up City Hall, how they can regain greater control over their own destiny, how they can stop the polluter. The idea that this can be done in a systematic way, a process of learning, whereby citizens can be 10 times more effective next year than they are this year because they're smarter at it, because they know the techniques, because they know how to develop the coalitions, because they know how to reach the areas or the change points. That has not really been developed in our formal educational system or in the general educational process informally outside schools. And what I think needs to be recognized on campus is that if there is one main objective to any educational process, liberal or technical, it is the development of the capacity and the will to be effective citizen strategists. Whether your ideals are liberal, conservative, radical, that's not the point. The point is that there will be instruments for people to use to apply their value systems, individually and collectively, on the institutions that are supposed to be delivering justice and the kind of services that we have a right to expect from them. And those kinds of techniques and those kinds of understandings can be a part of the formal educational process if students are given an opportunity to overcome the prime obstacle to education, which is sheer and utter boredom. You see it everywhere. You go through any library on any campus, that's where students are supposed to study most intensively, I suppose. And for example, just a few months ago, I went through the Princeton University Library, and I went into the reading room. What did I see at 8 o'clock at night? About a third of the students were reading away, another third were lolling around, talking and gabbing, and another third had their heads flat on their open books, sound asleep with saliva drooling onto the pages. The amount of time that's wasted on campus is absolutely enormous. You could literally take a 4-year liberal education and easily pack it into 10 months of rigorous work. And what's needed, I think, is to recognize that this is an enormous opportunity in your lives. You may disbelieve this, as you have a right to disbelieve. I didn't believe it either when my anthropology professor told me this. Is that you will never again be as free as you are now. Never as flexible, as idealistic, as willing to risk and think new thoughts and build new projects and programs. And as such, this is the time to take advantage of. And if you recognize that, by and large, most students are not meeting a fraction of their potential, a fraction of their contribution, that if they can work on problems that they think are important, whether they're in the area of poverty, pollution, professional society reform, educational reform, government process, no matter what it is, new detection systems for side effects of contaminants, whatever the issue may be, depending on the discipline of knowledge that you prefer, that if you work on real problems, that is, problems that now exist, that are going to exist in the future, that you're going to be victimized by, or that you're going to have to be challenged by, and if you work on them as part of courses, seminars, independent papers, summer task forces, dig out the facts. Don't just say, well, I got to write a paper. So you psych out the professors. He's shown a predilection for certain topics. So you psych out the professor, you run to the library, you get together 15 or 20 sources to develop a critical mass for footnoting purposes, and then you deliver yourself an innocently plagiarized paper. It doesn't do your professor you any good. Get out into the field. Take a problem where you're going to have to see the process of fact gathering. See how it's developed. See how it accretes. See how it's snuffed or stifled or manipulated or suppressed. And then develop the analysis. Articulate the problems. Develop the strategies. Start implementing the strategies to see exactly how the subject matter being studied responds to this kind of external pressure. Now, these are problems that you can discover or find anywhere. They're very well represented all over the country. You don't have to go very far. And there's hardly a social or a human or a political or economic problem that you can point to that doesn't challenge right across the board all of these disciplines at the universities that are all sliced up into artificial distinctions like psychology and politics and economics, primarily for analytic and administrative reasons. But basically these problems represent a human or seamless web of knowledge and challenge. Now, where does iceberg step in here? It's a very, very critical development in the educational process. It basically says the following, as I interpret these student action groups, 2 of which are already underway, one in Oregon, statewide, one in Minnesota, statewide. About 60% of the student bodies in each of those states petitioning with the boards of higher education approving of the petitions. The premise is the following: you're a better student if you're a better citizen. That the distinction between the role of the student in the ivory tower and then the role of the citizen later on after you graduate is not only false, it's destructive of the use of these great young human resources that you represent. It takes utterly too long in the United States to grow up. The prolonged adolescence is staggering. It's moving into the mid-20s, if not the late 20s, before people are, okay, now you're ready to go, to meet the cold, cold world. Where you're as creative, as imaginative as you'll ever be. 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. We recognize, for example, that the greatest contributions in the scientific world have come from young scientists, largely in their 20s and early 30s, some in mathematics in their teens. And I think we've got to recognize that many other fields of human endeavor, the great creativity comes from the young. And to develop a process of prolonged adolescence, a process where people in their late teens or early 20s spend endless hours trying to figure out rather trivial interpersonal relationships, or whether they've got too much acne, or whether their appearance is just right. And this is exploited by these companies that develop a concern, transform it into a neurosis, a psychosis, and then just take millions of dollars of expenditures and billions of hours of time just in the cosmetic area alone. For what? To develop a kind of ingrained insecurity that's easily manipulated. It happens to form the basis for a large market. The problem of growing up fast is the problem of self-awareness of what you can contribute. And these kinds of organizations, such as the Iceberg, is basically very simple. It simply says the following: look, people have got to experiment with new democratic forms, and they're not experimenting enough. And one experiment that has a good deal of success behind it is that if people are represented by full-time professional advocates, lawyers, economists, scientists, physicians, who take the concerns that people have about economic problems or medical problems or legal or consumer or environmental issues, and full-time at the scene of the action, before the legislature and the courts, before the regulatory agencies, before corporations, develop the strategies of reform and change, and develop the kinds of opportunities where thousands of students, depending on how many hours they want to give, can input with laboratory testing, research, interviewing, writing. You have developed a catalyst for student-citizen action that will have no limits. It will spill over into other age groups and other working groups. There's no reason why this shouldn't encourage retired people to develop their own full-time citizen action groups based on volunteer help. They have the time, the experience, and the freedom to do that at the present time. This extends to basically also experimenting in how people's wills and desires can be made more effective and more easily responded to. The concept is really also very modest. It says, will students in effect spend 2% of what they spend on an average year on cigarettes, liquor, candies, and movies? That's what the students in Oregon were asked by their fellow students. Will you spend $3 out of the $250 that the average student spends on these commodities? And if you're really for peace and justice and equity and progress and higher quality of living and the like, then why is that $250 the students in Oregon asked going to support Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Frito-Lays, and Seagrams, and all the rest of it? It's a tough question to ask. It was almost corny. It was so mundane, you see. But basically, before people wait for some angels to come along and to develop all these glorious institutions, they've got to ask what they can do, given their very modest resources. How are they expending it? And for roughly the equivalent of a football ticket or a round of pizza on Saturday night, once a year, students on a statewide basis can develop an Iceberg-type organization that they control and direct and participate in by the thousands. And the student task forces, similar, for example, to the ones that have done such great work on government agencies in Washington, or the ones that just produced that DuPont report that was released yesterday from our offices. That there's a great deal that students can do by way of first-rate research, analysis, and proposals. But they need that core catalyst of full-time professional representatives. Educationally, it can revitalize the educational process. Because as these issues surface for people to do something about in the state, they begin to be demands on knowledge, demands on analysis, which the university world should be primarily equipped to provide, not as a university, but in terms of individuals who form the university community. How simple is it? Let me perhaps give you an indication. In Minnesota, 3 dynamic students organized the entire state. 3 students, not that they did it all, but they were the core, sort of full-time extracurricular students who got other students to give less time, who in turn got other students to give less time, and the organization came across in less than 3 months. About 60,000 students signed that petition. There has never been that proportion in the history of the university world in this country. Never. Not on any issue, national, international, or local. And the Minnesota Student Public Interest Research Group now has 10 people working. They're beginning to put out their reports, develop the strategies, and they're underway. And there's no reason why 7 or 8 more states, including Iowa, can't get underway for next year. And there's no reason why every state in the union can't have this kind of full-time student-citizen action and research group. And there's no reason why, with the advance of the 18-year-old vote, that students and other young people cannot begin to forge the strategies of committed citizenship that will make them a leading democratic power in the land, and that will enable them to take on these special interest groups and take them on with equal, if not superior, power. It's often, I'm afraid, expected that it takes an overwhelming amount of power to defeat a special interest group, say on a legislative issue. That's not true at all. As a matter of fact, it takes far less than would meet the conventional imagination. I can give you illustrations where 2 lawyers overpowered the coal and steel industry and got through a very tough occupational health and safety law in Congress, largely because they were there full-time, scene of the action. They had the information. They knew how to get it disseminated through the media. They knew their Congress. They knew which committee chairman had to be persuaded to take hundreds of votes along with each committee chairman, and they got it through against a very, very sizable countering lobbying force. Why? Because in the ultimate analysis, there is no reason whatsoever why Congress shouldn't be controlled by the people. It's a more difficult task to control a bureaucracy or an executive branch. It is obviously within the realm of prompt feasibility for people to control the legislatures. And that is the first step toward growing democratic control over the processes of government, as our Constitution posited a couple hundred years ago. Now, these kinds of awarenesses cannot be read about. They cannot be heard. They've got to be experienced, so you have a feeling of what incremental, countervailing citizen power can do, what it can't do. So you have a feeling of how to proceed. You have a feeling of how to learn from your last mistake. You have a feeling of how not to despair. You begin to realize that this short-run despair and discouragement that students reflect very often is unheard of in other areas of student activity, like sports. The ethic on the athletic field is you never give up. You always design around the obstacle. You always give all you've got. You don't drop out. These are ironclad ethics. If you don't obey them, you're not around on the team very long. This is the kind of stamina and forcefulness and persistence that the iceberg-type organization will require to get underway and to succeed and grow and recycle back its revitalization through the educational processes that the students engage in. Now, this really isn't one of history's greatest sacrifices or achievements, but the point is clear, in that if these small steps cannot be taken, how are bigger steps going to be taken? And if these trivial sacrifices aren't going to be made in terms of student fees, how are more contributions going to be given as the students begin realizing that, begorra, things can be changed if people apply their energies to it, if they have a new concept of citizenship involvement. Already, Iowa is probably in the forefront of the states most likely to set up a student action group. There are at least 8 other states that are working very actively by students to set up these organizations. But the encouraging reports among various campuses here in Iowa is basically that it is a very realistic prospect to get underway and join its Minnesota cousins early in the school year next year. Now, this requires first signing the petitions. It requires understanding exactly what is at issue. It requires you questioning the student leaders who are trying to establish iceberg, getting the information, asking how the board of directors is going to be chosen from various campuses, how the issues to be worked on are going to be chosen. There's been a great deal of that discussion going on here at the campus. The student newspaper, probably more than anyone that I've encountered, has given an opportunity for this kind of exposition. And this is the kind of involvement that will lead to a rapid 55 or 60 or even higher percentile support by the students. But in conclusion, let me just say that after you review the history of student movements in the last 20 years, the first 10 years were no movement at all. You know, the so-called silent generation in the 50s, of which I was a part, a student. I remember when I was at Princeton in the 50s, the ultimate act of student dissent was not to wear white buck shoes and a freshman beanie. That labeled you as a real rebel. In the 1960s, the students woke up. They began to be concerned. They began to find out what was going on. They began to research, to investigate, to act. But in the late 1960s, a year or two ago, there was sort of a break. It was as if a mass amount of despair set in. And yet, look what the students achieved in the last 10 years. With no organization, no full-time representatives, with all kinds of energies broken by graduation, vacation, exams, and all the discontinuities that mark the student scene. They mightily staffed the civil rights movement. They transformed the nation's awareness on the ecology issue. They almost, I would say overwhelmingly, were the factor in mobilizing the forces that changed the official policy in Vietnam. And they didn't achieve the Valhalla. They didn't achieve everything. But if they asked themselves how many students participated and how many hours were put in by the students that participated, the conclusion is that it was a fraction of 1%. And now the next stage is necessary to develop the catalyst, the link that will make the continuity displace the discontinuity, to develop, in effect, your own full-time advocates that will structure the issues for you with your participation and direction, and it will open the opportunities for all these massive student energies and voting power to focus on issues that really count and to generate the educational and analytic and value input that will not just make the educational experience so much worthwhile, but to recreate that process of self-renewal after graduation that makes the stamina of citizenship endure year after year with no wholesale delegation to faraway institutions. You might go back into the early history of the country, and it's obvious that nothing that was worthwhile that was developed in this country came out of a silent majority. A silent majority which is kind of like a figment of a few politicians' imaginations. The issue basically is commitment, and every step of progress along the way, which often has occurred throughout history, has occurred because of the leadership of the few and the support of the many. And now what we want to develop is the support and the leadership of the many, so that everybody feels that they have their own input, whether it's small, middle, or large. And so they don't rely on single individuals or leaders, but that they recognize the leadership function to be sure, but they realize that if it's ever going to be viable and consistent and enduring and non-elitist, it's going to have to rely on the rank, the file, the people, the citizens, the consumers, the workers, the farmers, whatever the designation may be in any community. Indeed, there is no institution in human history, no matter how democratically structured, whether it's corporation, government agency, union, cooperative, that doesn't concentrate power in the hands of a few, that doesn't generate bureaucratic problems and costs, if those who are to be served by these institutions don't grapple continually and participate continually in the renovation of these institutions. It's not just a participatory role, it's the most fundamental type of democracy of all, initiatory democracy. The right the capability, the willingness to initiate democratic forms in action. And that's what Iceberg is all about. That's what MPIRG in Minnesota is all about. That's what OSPIRG in Oregon is all about. That's what other PIRGs in other states will be all about as they develop the first continuous drive in the student area for a combination of the student's educational role and his citizenship role, and permit a great diversity of viewpoints, a great diversity of activities, and begin to show that these are just the forerunners of democratically based institutions controlled by the members that they serve in order to monitor, shape, and generate the quality of democracy that will make the more established institutions work or change. Thank you.
You have been listening to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today you have heard the concluding portion of an address given by consumer advocate Ralph Nader concerned with the public interest and its relationship with corporate interest and government bureaucracy. The talk was recorded at Iowa State University in the James Hilton Coliseum in November of last year. University Lecture is a presentation of Iowa State University Radio.